Today I want to talk about a topic that you're probably very familiar with because every Go programmer comes across this topic. That is how to synchronize maps. Go maps are not thread safe, so if you want to have concurrent access to maps, you need to make them thread safe, and there are several methods. The method that is usually recommended is to use mutex. So if you use a mutex, you guard access to the getter and setter of the map. That's very well known and it's usually recommended. Then there's also read-write mutex. So you guard the write access differently from the read access, which allows multiple read access. Now, there is a method that I wasn't aware of, and that is using an atomic value, and I use this in my prefs here. That was recommended to me by ChatGPT, and I kind of blindly trusted ChatGPT and implemented this because I found it curious. I didn't know that method. So you're using an atomic value. You're making the map and store it in the value. Then if you get a value from the map, you first get the map. That is an atomic operation, so it's thread safe. And then you use the map normally as you usually would. And that is a very fast operation because the atomic access here just basically gets a pointer. I mean, this is stored as an empty interface value here, but you cast here the type back to the map, and that's all very fast. It's just a pointer in the end that is accessed atomically. But of course, then the setter cannot just set values in the same way. And here is the trick. Here's the big trade-off. Setting becomes a linear complexity operation. So it has complexity O(n), that's linear, in the size of the map, because we have to copy the whole map. So the whole map is copied whenever you set one value, which is of course very costly. So that's a very high trade-off. The getter is supposed to be a little bit faster. Should be the fastest operation you can have to get in a concurrent safe way. But the setter is then very slow. And you create a new map with a capacity one higher than the old map. You copy the old map into the new map here. And then you set the value and then you store atomically again. So that was the suggestion by ChatGPT that I implemented, and then I got some doubts. Maybe I shouldn't trust ChatGPT so blindly, right? It's kind of an odd suggestion, and of course, the setter is not what you usually have in a hash map then. Now, I got curious and wrote some benchmarks, and here's where it gets surprising. So I implemented here some mutex map with a setter that uses the mutex to lock. The getter also uses the mutex to lock and unlock. So the unlock is of course deferred, which is always the safest option. And then I also implemented the read-write mutex map. It's the same as the mutex map, but it has a read-write mutex here. Now in the setter you lock and you unlock because you're writing. And in the getter you use the read lock and you unlock read for reading. That means you can have multiple concurrent read accesses, but not at the same time some write access. So the write access blocks the read access, but the multiple concurrent read accesses can be in parallel. So then I implemented the atomic map as before with the preferences. So it atomically loads the map, uses the map for the getter normally, and copies the map as I showed to you for the setter, so it has linear complexity in the size of the map. All right, quick intervention. This method doesn't work at all. If you look at atomic set, this loads atomically, of course, but then it makes a copy, and making this copy takes time, of course. While it makes this copy, some other setter might load atomically the old map, and so values might get lost. It's a classical race condition, and if you look at this graphics, it will illustrate that. This diagram, you have time going down. A and B are go routines. Now A is a bit faster. It's supposed to set key 1 to value 1. B is supposed to set key 2 to value 2. Now A loads atomically, of course. Then it makes the copy. While it makes the copy, B atomically loads the map, and the map is still M1 because it's not stored here. A has not stored M2 yet, so it's still M1. It makes a copy, it sets the value, and then atomically stores M3. A does that too, but is finished earlier, so key 1 and value 1 are only in M2. B does not know anything about that, and so in the end, M3 is stored and key 1 and value 1 are missing. So this is a classical race condition and this cannot work. The setters need synchronization. Basically, there should only be one setter at a time, or you have some kind of inconsistent copies and need to kind of merge them. And this implementation does not do that. So ChatGPT's suggestion is just not working. It's just incorrect. And I quickly wanted to mention that before going on. And now you can watch the rest of the video. Now, as a test, I use 100,000 values and keys. I use random strings of length 10 for the keys and length 20 for the values. These are Unicode strings, of course, but they don't contain any special characters. So these are 10-byte keys and 20-byte values. Now, what's not very realistic here is that I didn't want to implement some complex producer-consumer pattern, which is what you should normally do in this case. Instead, I just spawn a new coroutine with every setting and with every getter. So every read and write access spawns a new coroutine, which is of course crazy because that means I'm spawning 100,000 coroutines each time. So that is not recommended. If you only have, say, 16 processor cores, you shouldn't spawn that many coroutines. On a side note, it's important to stress that you should also not just spawn as many coroutines as you have virtual cores on your machine or cores on your machine. That's a bad idea because under normal circumstances, many coroutines will be blocking because of I/O operations. And whenever you have a blocking I/O operation, the Go scheduler will switch to another coroutine, and this switch is going to be very fast. It's not a full context switch of an OS thread. So it's a good idea to usually have way more coroutines running if you have high concurrency than you have cores. But it shouldn't be in 100,000s range because every coroutine requires some memory. It requires at least 4 kilobytes of memory. I think maybe in some runtimes, or maybe this is configurable, could also be 8 or 16 kilobytes, but I know for sure that it's at least 4 kilobytes. So that, of course, is a high toll to pay because this memory needs to be allocated. So coroutine spawning is not completely for free, even though it's very fast. So a good ballpark is usually like a few hundred coroutines, maybe a few thousand, but this needs to be measured. If you only access memory, it might make sense to only spawn as many as you have virtual cores because there are no blocking operations here. But generally, you have some blocking operations and then you should spawn more coroutines. So that's something that you have to benchmark. But in this case, of course, this is just unrealistic, but since I do the same in every test, it should be fine. Now, let's get to the benchmark here. Let's compile this and run it. And you will see the surprise here soon. By the way, I also test sync map, of course. That's something I should have mentioned in the beginning because that's where the surprise comes in. So, not very unsurprising is that atomic map write is very slow. Of course it is. It has a higher complexity. So that is expected. Then what's also expected is, of course, that the read-write mutex map is much faster on read. So you should use a read-write mutex, not a mutex when you can. You should definitely do that because the mutex is kind of slow in comparison to the read-write mutex. The read-write mutex can even beat the mutex in writing sometimes, but it's usually slower, as you can see here. But in reading, it's always much faster, so that's a good idea. But the surprising thing, as you can see, of course, here is the sync map, because the sync map has extremely fast write speed. It's faster than all of the other methods in writing here, and that's what surprised me. And it's also among the fastest in the read performance. Okay, atomic map is a little bit faster here, but it's certainly or likely not worth the trade-off here because the write speed is so extremely slow and it's another complexity class. So you probably don't want to use atomic map techniques like I showed you. I will change that back in the preferences. It makes no sense unless you basically never write or almost never write and only in the beginning create that. But then there is also constant hash maps and there are a few other techniques that are even faster. So then you shouldn't have a need for a full map. So there are better ways of dealing with that. Right, so this is really astonishing because the write speed beats the other ones too, and the read speed is very fast. So sync maps beat the other maps anytime. I mean, even if it's a little bit slower in reading, this should barely make a difference. So they are all in the same ballpark. So there is no reason not to use a sync map. That's basically the lesson of this little story. And the other lesson is probably not to take ChatGPT at face value when it makes some suggestions here, because, okay, the read speed is fast, but the write speed is just not worth that. Use a sync map for everything if you want concurrent access. That's the lesson I would learn from it. And that's contrary to the docs, which still say that you should not use sync maps if you have a lot of writing of values. Apparently, this is no longer true. And that's it for today. I hope you found this video interesting, and see you another time. Bye.